Welcome. My name is Christine Smith. I am a clinical psychology doctoral student at William James College. And what I'd like to share with you today is my dissertation research. I conducted a study called Women in Engineering: Factors Contributing to Career Sustainability. I should also mention that I was a biotechnology engineer, a chemical engineer by trade, but I worked in biotech for 6 years prior to changing careers into psychology. So that certainly motivated my interest in this topic and the study design. But I will come back to this point later when I talk about limitations of this study. So in this presentation, I am going to go through the study's design, I'm going to go through the results, and I'm going to share with you some implications of these results. And I'm really looking forward to sharing them with you. I should also mention that while today, this recording date is August 23rd, 2020, this presentation was also defended on August 17th, 2020 at William James College. So first, I want to give you some kind of lay of the land with regard to women in engineering. So there is a statistic from the National Science Foundation indicating that 14% of all engineers identify as female. That's a pretty low number as reflected by the graphic on the right. The red dots would indicate 14%. We also know that 22.5% of students attaining engineering degrees identify as female. So some folks might look at these two statistics and say, wow, 22.5% of graduates are women, yet there's only 14% of practicing engineers who identify as female. And thus that reveals kind of this leaky pipeline that you might hear folks talking about. We know that attrition, unfortunately, is an issue for women in engineering and also more broadly for women in STEM fields. And STEM, for folks who aren't familiar, stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Glass et al. Did a really wonderful study that was published in 2013 where they looked at STEM women as compared to non-STEM women. These are professional women. And they looked at their attrition over 12 years. Their findings indicated that 50% of STEM professional women exited their fields to non-STEM jobs, whereas only 20% of the non-STEM women exited their careers overall. So really the conclusion that was drawn from this study by Glass et al. Is that STEM women leave at high rates to non-STEM jobs. Why do women leave engineering? That's a very well-researched question. And I would like to provide you with some particular studies. These are all really wonderfully carried out studies investigating this question that is actually not the question that this present study is focusing on, but I will share with you some of the results from these studies. So their findings indicated that women leave engineering because of, as compared to their male counterparts, they have lower pay, inadequate promotion opportunities, and also they might find difficulty managing familial roles. They have inflexible work demands. There may be work culture and climate issues, hostile work environments, gender socialization across the lifespan as it contributes to workplace issues, as well as issues related to sexuality in the workplace. I also wanted to mention that as a part of this dissertation research, I reviewed several bodies of literature just so that I could get a better understanding as to women in engineering in general and what research has been done on this population. So I looked at the history of women in engineering, gender socialization, all the way from like basically toddlerhood through adolescence and college age, and then into adulthood. I looked at family dynamics of women in engineering, and I investigated engineering workplace culture and climate. I'm not going to be talking about that. It's not really within the scope of this presentation, but in the notes for this presentation, I'll leave my contact information. So if folks want to be directed in the, pointed in the direction of this research, I can provide you with some really illuminating studies. So I also want to highlight a quote by Elena Percival, the CEO of Women Who Code. And this particular organization is definitely slanted more in the software engineering area. And she was asked in an interview about her opinion regarding the high attrition rates for women in STEM. And her quote is also pretty illuminating. She said, "There are things that are so small you'd never even complain about them, but they happen day after day. They're the kind of things that separate and exclude you from the team and make you say, hey, is this the right career path for me?" So I want to come back to this idea of the 14%. So you can kind of like blur your eyes when you look at this graphic and think, wow, what a bummer. You know, there's so many gray dots on there. There really aren't many women. But you can also look at this and kind of scratch your head and think, wow, there's actually quite a few red dots. Let's actually take a glass 14% full approach here and think, wow, those 14 dots on there, I wonder what the experience is for those women. Despite these well-documented and well-researched challenges they face, what is their experience? How do they cope with those challenges? Do they actually encounter them? Maybe are their personalities in some way, you know, different from other engineers that protect them from attrition? So this led to my research question, which formally was, what is the experience of the 14% of women who remain in the field of engineering despite the well-researched challenges they face? More specifically, I was curious about internal and external factors for them. So internal factors would be psychological factors, factors within the individual, things like personality, like I mentioned, things like coping skills, somebody's emotional experience, the way people think through things, their upbringing, things internal to the individual. External factors would be things in someone's environment, which could include things like their social environment. It could include their physical work environment, things like that, things that maybe we can't control as much. So what did my research design and procedures look like? So this was a qualitative grounded theory design. And for folks who aren't familiar with grounded theory, what it basically is a model that comes out of the study is grounded in the data. As the researcher, I'm not trying to force the data into any kind of a model, but I'm really looking to the data to find a model that's grounded. And you'll see that come through as I continue this presentation. I gave my participants a semi-structured interview. So there was an interview protocol, but they certainly had the freedom to talk about whatever they wanted. And you'll see the interview protocol, I'll show you. I also gave them all a personality measure called the NEO, which I'll explain further, and a demographic survey. I, pre-COVID, conducted this study remotely, mostly via Zoom. I actually gave participants the choice as to whether they would prefer Zoom or in person. And I had 14 participants, 13 of the 14 preferred Zoom. The reason I selected potentially doing this remotely was that engineers are busy people. So I wanted to be able to have this not include transportation time. Also, they're really tech savvy. And I also thought I could capture a bigger geographic sample, which actually was accomplished, you'll see shortly. So that actually worked out really well in this study. I also wanted to make a note about solicitation. So I solicited folks, my first kind of attempt at solicitation was through Facebook and LinkedIn by putting like a pre-approved message out there to folks where I really asked them, how does being a woman, I'm looking for participants for a study where I'm investigating how being a woman does or does not influence your experience as an engineer. So a pretty neutral question. I actually was bombarded with responses, so I needed to do no further solicitation after that. The study solicitation materials were shared in the Society for Women Engineers, SWE, and Engineering Moms. And also on LinkedIn, it kept getting shared, and I unfortunately lost track of where the study went, but I got pretty much all of my participants that way. What were my participation criteria? I had 5. The first one was that they had to have engineer in their job title, and this precluded engineering managers from participating. Also, engineering professors. I wasn't looking for an academic sample. I wanted folks who were practicing in the field now. I also limited my study to cisgender female identifying participants. And while I will acknowledge this as a significant limitation of this study, it was really important during study design that I balanced inclusivity with generalizability. And while it would be so critical to understand the experiences of all women, unfortunately in this study, I did limit my sample to cis women, and I'll talk more about that. I also wanted folks to have at least 3 years of experience. That way they had a narrative to tell. And greater than 3/4 of their work experience had to be in the US. And they had to be in a male-dominated organization, which for the purposes of this study just meant that in their organization or department, there had to be more men than women. So this is my interview protocol. I'm not going to go through all the questions that I asked the participants, but I want to highlight 4 questions that yielded the most data. The first one was my opener. I'd like to begin by asking you to reflect on how your experience of being a woman has influenced or has not influenced your experience as an engineer. The next most important question was, can you tell me about a specific professional challenge you faced and how you overcame it? And here you can see in the study design, I wasn't asking folks, why do you want to leave? You know, what are the real bummers in your field? It was more, we know that there are challenges. Tell me what they are and how did you overcome that? The next question was, in reflecting back over your full career in the engineering field, are there any factors that have contributed to your staying? And I actually that question followed, have you ever thought about leaving? So I was really curious about why they decided to stay. And lastly, actually the question that I think yielded the most data in this whole study was, is there anything I haven't asked you or that has not come up that would be important for me to understand about your experience? I think because the women were really kind of primed by these questions, they had so much more to talk about. So I really appreciated their candor and their willingness to just kind of freely elaborate. They shared with me such rich narratives. So next I want to talk about the NEO. I did ask them all to complete basically a 10 to 15 minute measure that's administered remotely. So it was just sent to them as a survey and they could fill it out. And actually all of them filled it out rather quickly. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the NEO measures personality when I talk about the results. And how did I analyze the data? I use Strauss and Corbin's coding technique, which has 3 phases. And you'll see on the right, this is a screen grab from NVivo, which is a piece of research, qualitative research software. And basically you can see there's a highlighted section, and that section was coded as having a particular theme or subcategory, actually. And sometimes the coded sections were full utterances like this. Sometimes it was just words, and sometimes it was phrases. So the lengths may vary. But basically the 3 phases involve open coding, so the data is organized into categories and subcategories, axial coding, where the data is then examined for relatedness, causality, or influence. And lastly, selective coding is where a statement, hypothesis, or model interrelates the categories. So you'll see that I actually did have a model at the end of this study, which is pretty exciting. I'm sure you're all waiting with bated breath here. So I want to share the results. First, I want to share the demographics, and while I'm not going to go through all of these, I first want to touch on a few important ones. So the first was that you'll notice I did have quite a bit of age diversity here, although you'll notice that women in their 40s were missing from this study. So it was mostly women in their 30s, one missing decade, but we got all the way up to folks who are approaching their 60s. I did certainly have a white majority in the sample, but I did get some racial diversity. And with regard to relationship status, most of the participants were married or in a committed relationship. And then when we go to the next demographic variable, partner work full-time, many of those women are thus in dual income relationships. And you'll see why that's important later. Many don't have children, just under half. You can see this is a very educated sample. And also with regard to years of engineering experience, this sample really, the study captured women who have been in the field for decades in some cases. So some really rich data here. Also, like I mentioned, because I was able to do this remotely, I did end up with a pretty diverse sample as far as US geographic location, as you can see, half being in the Northeast. So the NEO, this is the personality measure, and this is based on the 5-factor model of personality. And what are those 5 factors? You'll see along the x-axis of this box and whisker plot 5 letters, NEOAC. Each one of those stands for a personality factor. So neuroticism is the first one, or the tendency for someone to experience negative affect or emotion. Extroversion, most folks are familiar with. So if they scored highly on this, they would be extroverted and kind of prefer large groups. Whereas if they scored low, the other pole would be introversion and kind of, folks who prefer more solitary activities. O is openness, and openness, if someone scored high on this, would indicate somebody who's open to new ideas, pretty flexible in their thinking, and also pretty divergent in their thinking. Potentially, if you score super high, you might have some bizarre thinking, and folks who are low tend to be closed. That's the other pole. A is agreeableness. That's pretty self-explanatory. And C is conscientiousness. So now that you know what all of them are, we can kind of look at our sample, and when we look at the boxes, which are the interquartile ranges, we can see that this is a pretty, firstly, conscientious sample, which was also indicated by the fact that they all filled this out and sent it back to me within 24 hours. Pretty impressive for research these days. But you can also see that some of the boxes are pretty wide, like agreeableness is pretty wide, extroversion is pretty wide. A pretty low neuroticism sample. And also openness is rather high. Openness has been known to correlate though with level of education, which is really important because this is an educated sample. But an engineer's job responsibility is also to think in a divergent way, kind of think out of the box sometimes. But what I really want to call your attention to is the whiskers. I'm not looking so much at the boxes when I'm thinking about this data. Even though I only have a sample size of 14, it's so striking the width or the range of personalities that were noted in this study. We really see a mixed bag of traits here. And the big takeaway is that, there might not be an engineering personality. We might assume that all engineers are introverted and maybe they're not very agreeable because they only align with what the data says. And we do see in the media some stereotypes of engineers, and one good example of that is our friend Dilbert, the cartoon who's sitting on the left here. And it's really important when I think about this data, overvaluing personality assessments in vocational profiling or in the hiring process. If hiring managers are really using culture fit as a hiring variable, this might actually be a really exclusionary practice, not just for women in engineering, but for folks of all genders. So I think that's a really important thing to highlight here. I know my sample was only 14 people, but there may be some more research needed in this area. So now I want to go over the thematic results. So what were the themes that came up and what was the model that I generated grounded in my data? And I'm about to show you. So the model ended up being called Career Sustainability for Women Engineering. It was titled such after I collected the data and started putting it together. And as for internal factors, which I mentioned before are more a woman's psychology, include navigating sexism, work attitudes and behavior, stress management, self-concept, work-life family balance, interpersonal strategies. And then we get to the external factors, which I mentioned are more environmental in nature. Those include social supports and workplace characteristics. So one thing that I wanted to point out is that Many sub-themes came up within these themes. So I'm really only going to be talking about the most frequent sub-themes that came up in each one. Otherwise, I could probably do like an hour presentation on each one of these. But one thing that came up among all 14 participants was the theme of navigating sexism. And you probably saw from my protocol of questions, I didn't specifically ask about this. So the fact that it came up so often is pretty indicative of the breadth and also the insidiousness of this issue for women across engineering disciplines. So one important question that many of them brought up was, if I'm experiencing sexism, or when I have in the past, should I say something? And the engineers said there are many reasons why they would say something. One of those reasons is to protect future generations of engineers. This was particularly notable among the older women in the sample. To stand up for themselves when no one else will. To satisfy others who felt uncomfortable. And this came up in one particular interview where the engineer was talking about how sometimes things happen in a meeting and there are many other people around the table of all genders who hear it and notice it and felt uncomfortable. One engineer, a municipal water engineer, said that she sometimes asks others to confront privilege, and she's almost taken on this social kind of justice, I don't know, this way of being where she's out in the world advocating for women by asking folks to confront their privilege, particularly male engineers. And one younger engineer with only 3 years of experience said, you know, sometimes it can be painful to sit in silence, so she's trying not to do that anymore. These engineers also have really good reasons why they might not say something, even if they're acutely aware that something sexist just happened. And one engineer in the software world highlighted something, actually it was computer hardware, highlighted something really important. She said in the late 90s, early 2000s, she worked for a household name computer company, and she walked into her manager's office and there was a cardboard cutout that was life-size of a St. Pauli's beer girl, which I guess is a really objectifying and kind of very sex-oriented image of a woman. And she said, you know, the cardboard cutout had the breasts hanging out and all. And she said that she really sat back and thought about, if nobody higher up in the organization has said something thus far about that cutout, is my saying something really going to generate change? And she actually decided not to say anything in that particular instance. She did note some instances where she did say something, where she may have said something to an ally higher up in the organization who she knew would help generate change. But that's a really important factor. I might not say something if the larger hierarchical organization doesn't have values that would help me generate change. Other reasons that somebody wouldn't say something, some engineers talked about, well, you know, the person was well-meaning in what they said. I let it go. Others, particularly with things like benevolent sexism, said, I'm not really bothered by the differential treatment. One environmental engineer said that drillers, she works out in the field, drillers tend to be more polite around women. And another engineer talked about men not getting into pissing contests with her like they might with other men. So they won't say anything in those cases because they think it's fine. They're not bothered by it. One also said with older folks who make sexist comments, it's like giving elders a pass. And lastly, a research and development engineer noted, she's younger, that a father-daughter dynamic developed between herself and one of her older male colleagues, and this was actually helpful for her in her career. So she perceived an occupational benefit from this differential treatment, so she decided not to say anything. One thing I want to highlight that folks did mention when they talked about saying something in the face of sexism was specific language. And I wanted to share that with you because I think sometimes it's just hard to find the words. So one engineer, a software engineer who was staying late at night at work with a male colleague, he noted to her, "You look stressed," and then proceeded to give her an unwanted shoulder massage. And she said, "That makes me uncomfortable," and he stopped. And she said that those words throughout her career have been very powerful. Other things that engineers said were words that they use are, I'm here to do engineering, not the other stuff. This was an engineer approaching retirement, actually, who said over her career, she's been asked to do a lot of administrative tasks, like taking meeting notes. So she will call people out when they ask her. Other folks said, knock it off. I don't get why that's funny. Explain to me why this is okay and why this is appropriate. You're never going to say that to me again. So some pretty wise words from these women. In navigating sexism, they also talked a little bit about internalizing versus externalizing the sexism. And they certainly didn't use this language, but internalizing sexism would mean if somebody says something sexist to me, am I going to actually take that in and consider what they said? And this is typically not a conscious process, and maybe believe some of what they said. Externalizing a sexist comment might look like someone saying, well, they said that to me and they're sexist. Maybe they externalize it in a really compassionate way, saying they come from a part of the world or maybe a religion where they just see women differently. Or maybe they'll say something, and I had one participant say this, my engineers, my colleagues sit behind computers all day and they don't really have good social skills. So that's how she externalizes it. The engineers also talked about how they've changed jobs, many times. One noted, and this is an engineer approaching retirement, she left her job every 9 years because she needed a change. And leaving a job is not a failure to tough it out. Berg in 2006, noted nonviolent sexist experiences, when occurring repeatedly, can actually be regarded as ongoing sources of traumatic stress. And when that intersects with other prejudice, racial, anything like that, ageist, this can leave women feeling more vulnerable to re-traumatization and can actually increase the risk for developing PTSD. And further, when society denies that these oppressive experiences happen, that's even worse. So it's really important to not see somebody who changes jobs throughout their career as kind of a failure. One thing that came up in this study that was so brilliant was the effective use of humor of these engineers. One engineer pranked her boss to stop a behavior that he was doing that was pretty micromanagery. And another, I want to highlight a particular quote that came up from a petroleum engineer. And she talked a little bit about PPE out in the field, noting that particularly with shoes, the women's shoes only really come with pink shoelaces. Those are the ones that protect the feet from crude oil. And that the frocks that they have to wear are very masculinizing of the body and don't fit women, particularly pregnant women, well. And often they'll have to be stapled to be tailored. And I asked her, well, how do you cope with this? And this was her response. She said, I'll just be like, look at me. I guess I have pink shoelaces. Guess I'm going to be that person with the clipboard, and now you'll know me kind of deal. Or I'm the goofy one with the clothing that doesn't fit out in the field. You just end up having to roll with it, I suppose. It's really hard to change the supply of things or budgets in those cases. So really, while I think everybody who listens to this and hears it can think like, wow, that's infuriating, this use of humor is psychologically really protective for her from burnout. So really, really important. Use of humor. I was just blown away by this sample's use of humor. So the second factor, and I also want to highlight, I'm not going to be spending as much time on the others. Navigating sexism was certainly the one that came up the most. The others we're going to be breezing through a little bit more quickly here. But work attitudes and behavior encompasses things like how they find their work. And these engineers found their work to be interesting, satisfying, and meaningful, which is important. They noted things like every day being different, not having repetitive work. One said, I like owning a whole big piece of something rather than just doing day-to-day tasks. And another said, I felt committed to satisfying the career challenge that I had been educated for. These women like their jobs. But interestingly, instead of saying, I have this deep passion for my work, many of them said, well, I like it enough. It's worth worthwhile and the pros outweigh the cons. So really important that these women aren't necessarily seeking a job where, it's perfect and they have this deep, meaningful passion, but it's good. And the pros outweigh the cons. That's so important. These engineers also pretty much across the board said, I could leave this job and find another one tomorrow. And a few of them had done that over the course of their careers and sometimes negotiated between offers. So in engineering, it seems like the demand for jobs is rather high, and particularly for women. A lot of hiring managers are specifically looking for women because they're so hard to find. These women also had a lot to say about stress management, as engineering is a stressful job. Also, prior research indicates that engineering is particularly demanding for women, actually disproportionately than men, because they also experience elder care and child care and home care responsibilities, whereas men often don't have these same responsibilities. This was from the Hewlett et al. Study in 2008 that was published by Harvard Business Review, a really, really worthwhile study. Many of them noted that engineering really ebbs and flows as far as the workload goes, and at periods of flow, it can just seem completely endless. So they were able to talk about, how do I think about these experiences? And some said, I actually put time boundaries around my work. And one engineer called that time boxing, which I guess is a term that's used in business and also software pretty frequently. So it's pretty cool that she applied that to her professional life. Some also noted that they don't respond to emails, calls, or one even said, I don't even care about work when it's not work hours. And one said, I'm going to get paid regardless. So she doesn't really go that extra mile if she gets a call after work hours. Overcoming self-doubt was such a prevalent theme that came up among these women too. It seems like doubt by others is something pretty commonly experienced. So one really described this experience well. She said, I think it is at least my perception that my coworkers are questioning my ability. And then I begin to question my own. So she noticed, am I internalizing some of that? Another said, in response to that, she used to look for validation by others. And she said, I didn't want to ask for a raise. I wanted to be given the raise. I wasn't willing to give myself the gold star. So she started countering some of that self-doubt by thinking or doubt by others by thinking, others' approval doesn't matter to me. As long as I give myself the gold star, that's all that matters. One of the best quotes that came out of this entire study was from a municipal water engineer who mentors other younger engineers. She also has a team of engineers below her, so she both practices and manages. And she has told many young women engineers, God grant you the confidence of a mediocre white man. Wise woman right there. Also, some other things that came up was the use of coping skills, and popular ones that came up included enjoyable movement, food, going out, with friends, and other things that came up were normalizing stress. Stress is a normal part of life. Everybody experiences stress, and I'm just experiencing it right now, and it ebbs and flows. And challenging automatic thoughts, something that in clinical psychology we're super familiar with. Women also do that pretty well. So they're really effective with stress management. They've navigated this quite well. Another theme that came up was self-concept. And what I really want to talk about is the experience of pride, which was expressed by all 14 participants. And the way that they talked about it was, I'm proud of my accomplishments. I'm proud of my subject matter competence and expertise. I'm intelligent, and I do my job well. And it also seems as though being a woman in engineering in and of itself is a source of pride. I'm a woman in engineering, gosh darn it, one said. And that engineer, a materials engineer, also noted that she had experienced some earth-shattering experiences of discrimination as a woman in engineering. And what she continued, her quote, and I'm still here. I'm still proud to be a female engineer. So this source of pride actually appears to be a really significant protective factor for building resilience in negative experiences. Why are these women so proud? Is this an inborn quality? Is this developed after continually accomplishing at work? Is this reinforced externally? Maybe it's a conscious practice to overcome self-doubt. I don't know the answer to that question, but this is so those are all, speculation, but this is a really significant finding because there's a lot of literature that says girls, adolescents, and women in their college years, and then women who go into the profession feel excluded from math and science and feel less confident in their abilities. But that is absolutely not the case for this sample, and it's really striking. The women also talked a lot about work-life-family balance, and that's what I called this domain, which encompasses both work-life balance and work-family balance. So with regard to work-life balance, many of the engineers said there was a certain point in my life where I had a conscious period of reflection, and they thought, how is work going to fit into my life? And some engineers said, you know what? It's a two-way street. It's a bidirectional give and take. Sometimes work needs me more. Sometimes life needs me more. And that's going to change over time. And I need to just go with that. But some engineers also indicated more a unidirectional approach. No, work fits into life, not the other way around. So while these seem to be different, both of them seem to be pretty appropriate and pretty effective. These women also had a lot to say about work-family life, given that many of them had partners, many of them had children, many of them are in dual income couples. And as we mentioned before, childcare, elder care, and household responsibilities do tend to disproportionately fall onto women as opposed to men in engineering. And a few of the women talked about how when their children were small, this was a particularly tough period. But the silver lining of the discussion here was that many of them who've come through that experience said it was finite. It was really hard, but it was finite. And one even said it was all a blur. But the strategies that these women tend to use when their kids are little was firstly having additional childcare in the home. Daycare didn't come up very much, interestingly, and I wonder if that's because transportation is certainly a perk of having childcare in the home. Also, the couples had, for the most part, egalitarian values. So one engineer, she's an industrial appliance engineer, she talked about how her and her husband kind of negotiate emergencies on the fly as they arise. So if they're both at work and their kid is sick, they'll call each other and say, when do you have a meeting? When do you have free time? But the one really important piece, this caveat that she mentioned, is you can't keep score. It doesn't work that way. And that's a really important caveat for couples, I think. Very wise. They also talked about two strategies which seem opposing, but different strokes for different folks is what I took away from this. Some really avoided bringing work home altogether and just said, you know what, I'm at my job when I'm at my job, and when I'm home, I'm home. Whereas others said, you know what, I actually work entirely from home. And that affords me more flexibility. One noted that she has a newborn, and after she came back from maternity, she shifted her position to entirely from home. She negotiated that, and she can breastfeed between meetings. So different strokes for different folks here. It really depends on what works for who. I also noticed one thing that came up in this study, which I am calling the boomerang effect. And before I talk about what that is, it seems like with competing family demands, lack of part-time engineering jobs being available, that's certainly a phenomenon that's in this field in particular. And also when women work the minimum, it's still pretty inflexible. Given these things, temporarily leaving and returning to engineering was an experience that was really notable in this sample, and it was described by 6 participants, so almost half, 3 of them talked about how they planned to do that when they had children, and 3 of them actually had done that already. And the 3 that had done it talked about how they went into business. One went into real estate and the other went into teaching. And sometimes it was for a decade or more before they came back. For some, it was much less than that. But Hewlett et al. In that Harvard Business Review study noted that the mid to late 30s time period seems to be some kind of watershed for women in STEM. And I think it's really important to note that that might actually not take into account the boomerang effect, the women who left and then came back in. I'm also wondering, and this is speculation, if this is a part of, or if this contributes to the fact that I had no women in their 40s in this study. I'm wondering if women in their 40s in engineering are hard to find, and I'd be curious to see what the research says. Future research, hopefully. And the last internal factor, interpersonal strategies. So the engineers talked about the importance of understanding others' points of view in conflict. 4 participants said they pick their battles. That's a notable quote. And they also talked about impression management. And impression management is an industrial and organizational psychology concept that's defined as trying to favorably manage the ways in which one is perceived by others at work. And this can be motivated by a variety of things, such as financial. Someone wants to favorably, have a favorable impression for financial reasons. They may just want to be liked. They may want to get the next project. They may want to be promoted, etc. But interestingly, the older engineers that were interviewed in this study were just talking about how that becomes less and less important with age. And some of them actually noted they will kind of stick their necks out now to protect the younger engineers who may have more on the line with regard to impression management. So really cool shift in perspective, it seems, as women age in engineering. They're also really crafty with interpersonal issues. It seems like their problem-solving abilities really span into the interpersonal domain. So one noted she delegates without authority to administrative staff when she is asked to do administrative tasks. One said she'll ask office staff to come onto the manufacturing floor if they're making a really unreasonable request. She'll say, hey, you come down to the manufacturing line, try out your idea, and then tell me what you think. I mentioned that one engineer pranked her boss, and they also craft emails in ways that are so creative. They might use metrics that are shown through graphics, or they'll be really choosy in the way they use their words and their language and who they CC. So really impressive problem-solving skills in the interpersonal domain. Now we're going to move into external factors. The first of 2, being social supports. So what did these women identify as their most salient social supports? Their immediate coworkers came up, allies came up, and I want to talk about both of these briefly. So with regard to immediate coworkers, participants said, a couple of them said, while they didn't like their management, they really liked their immediate coworkers. And this really seems to mitigate negative experiences coming from management. With regard to allies, what is an ally? And I asked the participants who brought up allies to describe what that means to them. And this is what they said. They said, it's when people stand up for me. It's when people directly ask my opinion in meetings. It's people who provide additional clout, which is interpreted as powerful influence, to a specific issue. It's when other folks publicly honor or praise them. Or in the event that someone's in a meeting, allies will join together with them in the face of dissenting opinions. So that's really important to people and really effective, it sounds like. Social media groups were also identified, which is really surprising because this is not in other literature. Particularly the Engineering Moms Facebook group seems to be really important. They give each other ideas. They talk about engineering and non-engineering topics. Also, 3 endorsed that they had been in therapy and found it to be helpful. I also asked the engineers how their social supports are helpful to them, and this is what they said. They said they look for someone to vent to, which means they can really let out their emotions freely without judgment. They're looking for a safe space. They want to feel less isolated in their stress. They may be looking for empathic listening. I don't want somebody to fix my issue. I just want them to say, yeah, that stinks. But sometimes they might actually be looking for a problem to be solved, and often they'll go to their team for that. They also talked about bouncing off things to others. And this last one, level setting, is really similar to the psychological concept of reality testing. That was what this term one engineer utilized. She's a civil engineer. And she described it as, she'll go to a colleague and say, am I crazy? Am I overthinking this? And the colleague might say, yeah, you're crazy. You're overthinking that. Or the colleague might say, no, you're not overthinking that. This is really important. And it appears that in either direction, this level setting is really effective and really important when it comes to social supports. A lot of the women talked about women's professional groups. And I pulled this quote from the Hewlett study, which is fascinating. That study, they noted women heaped scorn on the utility of these programs and see their weak sisters as a threat to upward mobility and thus don't participate in these groups or have mixed feelings about it. I didn't see that particular data point arising from these 14 engineers, but I will say that it seems like there's some ambivalence. 5 of the engineers said that women's professional groups are really inspiring, supportive, and helpful, whereas 5 mentioned that they're exclusionary, and 3 used the word cliquey, all 3 of them referring to the Society of Women Engineers, or SWE. So pretty mixed perspectives. So the last factor in this whole model, the second external factor here, is workplace characteristics. So I first want to start by talking about how 80% of my participants noted that their organizations see them positively. And they said that by saying, my organization thinks I'm competent. I know my organization sees me as a leader. They see me in a respectful way, and they think I'm trustworthy. And I want to draw a parallel here to a study that came out of the VA, Harris et al. In 2011. And they talked about people in religious communities. And I know this sounds really discrepant, but I have a point, I promise. So in this study, some of their findings included, if a person believes that their faith community sees them non-judgmentally, that they have value as a person, then this community really facilitates resilience and the ability to recover quickly in the face of a trauma. However, if a religious community is judgmental and thus perceives the person as bad and doesn't support the growth of that person, this person may be more likely to have difficulty recovering from trauma and then further have difficulty reconciling their relationship to their faith. So while religious communities and organizational communities certainly have their differences, I think the real parallel to draw there is that the impact of an organization holding a really positive and non-judgmental perception of an engineer can really impact career sustainability and be really protective for an engineer and build resiliency. So pretty important finding. Also, many of the women, most of them, noted they really value flexibility, and this can look like the ability to work from home, or it might look like the utilization of flex time, so being able to work extra one day and then working a little bit less the next. It'll be so interesting to see if COVID-19 leaves a legacy of this, because I imagine that many of the engineers in this study now have that flexibility. Maybe if they didn't before, it would be really interesting to follow up. One thing that also came up is pros and cons to specific industries. So for example, one petroleum engineer was talking about how the bathrooms at her sites, because they were built in World War II, were really insufficient for women. There actually weren't enough of them, and they weren't very clean. But there are some pros to being in that particular industry, money being one of them, and another being that she found her job really interesting. Another who worked for a startup talked about how, she has a lot of power in her organization because she was one of the first hires in a really small company. But again, the bathrooms were an issue because there were only 8 employees. They only had one bathroom and she had to share it with the men. I know I'm highlighting bathrooms here, but a number of pros and cons really came up across different industries. One engineer who worked for the government noted that the government is really slow and bureaucratic, so it's hard to get things funded quickly. But she could work from home sometimes and it was pretty flexible. It was kind of a 9 to 5 job. So what I'm trying to say with that is it's a call for engineering programs to do more career development, particularly around industry to person value alignment. In engineering programs, it doesn't seem like, while there are various disciplines of engineering, maybe the professors could go a little bit more into, hey, you can go to these different fields within this particular type of engineering. Here's the pros and here's the cons. Pick based on what you value. Also, what came up for, I think, 3 participants was they observed other women leaving, and that really created an emotional toll and also elicited some self-doubt. So this is a call for organizations to really process and speak openly about these experiences and women's reactions to them as they arise. So I want to come back to the model here, and I want to highlight 2 things. One is that we notice a little bit of an imbalance in quantity between internal and external factors. This should not be interpreted in a manner that puts onto women in engineering the need to consistently overcome adversity by engaging in a consistent exercise of psychological strength. But instead, it should really be looked at as a negotiation of their strategies against an environment that's really tough. So overall, women really need to navigate these factors. So for example, let's say a woman in engineering experiences a lot of sexism, but she has a really positive self-concept. She finds her work-family balance to be tolerable. She has a ton of social supports and likes the characteristics of the workplace. Those might all be pretty significant protective factors and kind of counter the experiences of sexism, thus contributing to her sustainability in the field. So negotiating these factors when women find new jobs, let's say they leave one and find another, they might be thinking about these factors, not necessarily consciously, but they know what they're looking for. So also over the course of one's career, there might be a cumulative effect of each of these. For example, if someone encounters sexism in every single place that they're at, that might put them more at risk. But if they have certainly positive experiences in the other domains, that may be protective. So because this is a study in clinical psychology, I want to talk about clinical implications. So I'm a therapist. What do I do if a woman in engineering walks into my office? And a few things that might be important to think about. One of them is, as therapists, we need to evaluate our own beliefs about stereotypes of engineers in general, also for women in engineering. And we also need to think about sexism, take a good hard look at our own personal beliefs when we're working with others who are different from us. It's also so important to maintain an ecological lens and just take into account the environment matters. We can't always just ask somebody to cope their way out of a really devastatingly biased environment. The impact of everyday nonviolent sexism is significant. Certainly not something to brush under the rug. We talked about how it can be viewed as a source of traumatic stress that's ongoing and chronic. And like that Berg study suggested, it may increase the risk for PTSD, even if these sexist events are not related to the index event. I also mentioned that women respond really thoughtfully or don't respond really thoughtfully to incidents of sexism. So either of those is fine. And it might just be helpful to have a client-led discussion where you kind of let them think through that. That's where they're at. Also, having a client-led discussion around their environment is really important too. A woman might seek to find a workplace where their identity is respected, privileged, and esteemed without challenge. And that should certainly be client-led, and it might be really important. And now I want to talk about limitations of the study, as there certainly are some. First, I mentioned my sample size was only 14, so not fully generalizable, but the really important part about that was that I got a really kind of beautiful and granular narrative. There were also obviously some demographic limitations. Only cis women were represented. It would be really wonderful to have captured folks who identify as trans, gender fluid, non-binary. So that's certainly a limitation. White racial majority, a limitation, and women in their 40s not being in this study, limitation. Also a lack of sexual orientation diversity. I also didn't talk, I didn't talk to women who were in STEM more broadly. It was only women. So these women are STEM, but they're only engineers. And like I mentioned at the beginning, I was an engineer myself, which certainly motivated this study. But I think the limitation there is that it may have impacted the way in which I designed the study and may have been biased in the way I interpreted the results, even though I really made a conscious effort to remain as unbiased as possible. I must acknowledge it as a potential limitation. So recommendations for future research, expanding the study, like I mentioned, trans, gender fluid, non-binary identities. It would be really interesting to do this with people who identify as male too. How would they answer these questions similarly or differently? I'd love to expand it to more racial identities. And while we think about expansion as being beneficial, actually narrowing the study would be interesting too. For example, narrowing to only specific types of engineers like computer engineering, chemical engineering, biotech, manufacturing, or narrowing it down to geographic location. What might it be like to be a woman in Austin, Texas versus Boston, Massachusetts? And like I mentioned, because I administered the NEO and got such fascinating data about the mixed bag of personalities, it would be really wonderful to see some larger studies on the personalities of engineers that use something like the NEO, which is a dimensional personality test, and also that is not pathologizing. It's really my favorite personality assessment, and it fits well to capture the data that I was looking for. And last, I really want to acknowledge some really important people for this study. The first being the participants, all 14 of you. I so appreciate your candor and your willingness to participate. I didn't pay my participants, so thank you. The study wouldn't be a study without you. I also want to thank my committee in the clinical psychology department at William James College, Dr. Jill Bloom and Dr. Catherine King. And I want to thank my discussant, Dr. Mary Fitzpatrick at the University of Wisconsin, who, when this talk was live for my defense, really spoke about how this data fits into the larger context of the research on women in engineering. I want to thank my research assistants, Juan Rosario, Taylor Pistrito, and Molly Church, also clinical psych students at William James College. They really helped me with the transcription of all of the interviews and also with SPSS, which I am just terrible at. I also want to thank my husband, Mark Smith, for his continued support, love, and in particular, support of my career change. Not all spouses would be supportive of that. I'm aware of how lucky I am. I want to thank my family, my parents, and my sister, and my parents-in-law, who all attended when this was a live presentation, which was fantastic. And of course, I want to thank the audience, both the audience who attended this live presentation and you who are watching this in this public YouTube domain. So thank you for your interest in this particular topic. I want to show you my references here. And again, I want to thank you so much for your sustained attention here. Thank you so much.